Let's have a conversation, Doug.
Great, Randy. Welcome to sunny Tempe, Arizona.
I'm glad to be here. You better believe it.
We're glad to have you here. So let's begin by talking about how you became interested in thinking about evolution in human behavior.
You know, it started as an undergraduate when I took on the project of trying to explain something modest like why there is aging. And that led right through till after I finished my psychiatry residency. Very frustrated that I couldn't find a solid foundation for the work. And I didn't want to become a psychoanalyst or a behaviorist or a brain scientist. I really wanted to understand behavior. So I started hanging out at the museum with these people who studied animal behavior. Dick Alexander, Barb Smuts, Bobby Lowe, Richard Wrangham, that gang. And there was a seminal moment for me when I explained to them my theory of senescence. It was very simple. I thought that it was very important for some members of a species to die so that there was room for others to evolve more quickly for the good of the species. And Bobby Lowe, bless her heart, just laughed and laughed. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she kind of said, "You seem like a smart fellow, but you don't know anything about biology." And it was the most wonderful thing anybody could have done for me because, instead of just being quiet and critical or something, it really brought me a sharp and made me realize my whole medical education had completely neglected half of biology. And then she and others put me on to Williams' 1957. And I read that paper and I realized, my God, if aging has an evolutionary explanation, then what about heart disease, breast cancer, schizophrenia, and all the rest? Very naive approach, but all of a sudden, that was the rest of my career.
So early on, did you experience obstacles to your moving in this direction?
Gosh, my committee for tenure told me that they would not hold it too much against me that I'd published a paper in 1984 about this, but they'd advised me not to do any more.
Really?
When I came up for professor, they told me explicitly on behalf of the committee that I had to stop doing this evolution stuff or I would never get promoted.
Wow.
So there were things like that. But I always kind of got along with people, and once I started explaining to them about evolution and animal behavior, they were interested. It also helped that I ran the residency program for many, many years and taught a course to the residents about evolution and behavior, which they liked a lot. And that had a big influence, actually, because a lot of those folks have grown up to be pretty good scientists who use evolution in ways that they never would have otherwise.
Today, within the field of medicine, is there more acceptance of evolutionary thinking?
Well, most doctors recognize there's no problem with evolution, but trying to apply it to medicine is something that's still just beginning, despite the efforts of a bunch of us for the last 20 years. It's been very frustrating that no medical school teaches the principles of evolutionary biology the way they teach physiology, anatomy, histology, or biochemistry. They just don't do it because there aren't any evolutionary biologists on the faculty. However, lots of kids are now getting undergraduate courses in evolution and medicine. And here is Arizona State. We've got a new center to try to do what we can to create new programs, master's degrees, and try to create new curriculum. It's coming along, but it's a slow process.
Right. So one of the questions they've been asking people is, what do you regard as your favorite contributions to the field over the years?
It's probably the most important ones have been helping to get things organized. Organizing the first meeting of what led to the society with Bobby. Certainly, intellectually, the most important thing is my work with George Williams. And at the core of that is really asking the question that hadn't been taken seriously before about why aren't bodies better designed? Just going through trait after trait, such as a narrow birth canal or wisdom teeth or vulnerability to cancer, and asking why didn't natural selection fix that? And it's interesting that our first 6 months of working together, we were just as naive as my students are now. We kept looking for, what's the evolutionary advantage of schizophrenia? And what's the evolutionary advantage of cancer? And finally we realized that was the wrong question. The right question is, why did natural selection leave us with traits that leave us vulnerable? It's a small change, but I think that's what led to the field getting interesting. Of course, a lot of people had always tried to understand the body in evolutionary terms and disease in evolutionary terms. Go all the way back to the blind watchmaker and the like. And It's a long story, and it's continuing to develop now.
Two that I like, and it may prime me to think of something else. You had a paper on drug addiction,
Yeah.
and from an evolutionary perspective. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, my only science paper, and it's very simple. Instead of asking the question about why some people become drug abusers, which is the main focus of research, we asked why all humans have a vulnerability. And the answer is extremely simple. It is that drugs have not been a part of our environment in any pure form with fast routes of administration until recent times. And if you've got a motivation system that runs on biochemical mechanisms, then something that stimulates those mechanisms is going to cause addiction. But it's more complicated than that, because only some people become addicts. Other people can chip away even at heroin and not become addicts. And that's the question I'd like to answer now. What's different in an environment with no drugs between people who are vulnerable to alcoholism and addiction and those who aren't? And I think there are people working on that now from an evolutionary perspective.
Another idea of yours that I think has a lot of, people mention you in connection to the idea of a smoke detector principle.
Yeah, that was when George and I wrote the book, I wanted to write about defenses. And George wasn't too keen on that at first, but he gradually realized that this is what doctors deal with. Mm-hmm. The problems people bring into the clinic aren't diseases, they're cough, fever, nausea, pain, vomiting, and all the rest, which are useful responses. And there I was treating people with anxiety disorders and wondering, what am I doing? Am I interfering with something that nature had shaped that was very effective? And it took me about a year to figure out that the right approach to this was using what's called signal detection theory, and to look at the costs of a false alarm and the cost of not experiencing a response when you really need one. And when I did the calculations, for instance, if running away costs you 200 calories and not running away when there's a danger present would cost you 200,000 calories, then it's perfectly normal for the system to have not only false alarms, but 999 out of 1,000 false alarms. And I took that back to the clinic, where I was seeing all these people who had panic attacks for no good reason in a grocery store. And I was just vastly more understanding what's going on. Instead of thinking there's something deeply wrong with their brains or their personalities, I realized, gosh, this is a false alarm. It's kind of what you expect from these kinds of systems. And what was really satisfying is that helped my patients too. Instead of saying, oh, is it really a heart attack? They were able to say, oh, this is a false alarm in my emergency response. And for some of them, that's all they needed.
Do you have any findings or papers that you feel were sort of orphaned, that went out there and you expected to have more impact but didn't?
Some of them have been cited a lot, but the field stays the same. One of my favorites is about evolution and depression, and it asked the title was, is depression an adaptation? And I was so pleased they published it in the Best Psychiatry Journal as the first paper in the first issue of the New Millennium. I thought, wow. And people still cite it, and it still seems right to people, but it hasn't changed what people do in the clinic at all. They keep looking for brain mechanisms and all the rest instead of trying to understand what mood is for. So that's been a bit frustrating. The other thing go ahead.
I was just asking you to talk a little bit more about that idea, what mood is for, and the application to depression.
This is the one that has turned out, when I teach psychiatry residents, to be the most useful of all. I basically started from foraging theory and behavioral ecology and tried to ask myself, in what circumstances would it be that decreasing motivation would be useful? And came to the fairly simple solution that when you're spending more calories than you're getting, or otherwise, incurring more costs than benefits, it's best to stop what you're doing, in a very simple notion. And so I played around with that idea for quite a while, and finally I talked with other psychologists at Michigan who pointed me to papers that I hadn't found because I was a psychiatrist, not a psychologist. Eric Klinger in particular wrote a paper in the 70s about this, and he basically laid out the whole thing. Essentially what he said is that low mood is a useful state when you're trying to pursue goals and not making any progress. You should decrease your effort, you should pull back, you should try a different strategy, and if nothing works, you should disengage from the goal entirely. And if you can't disengage from the goal entirely, what's ordinary low mood just escalates and escalates and escalates into really severe depression.
Mhm.
And there you have it in just a few sentences to explain a whole lot of what you see in the clinic. And my psychiatry residents tell me this is the most useful thing I teach them. So that by the time they're finished, they go out and they start talking with their patients. Is there something you're trying to do in life that's really difficult and very important to you and it's not working, but you can't quit?
Mhm.
And the answer to that question often is the real key to what's going on. However, I hasten to emphasize that there are a lot of people whose depression has nothing to do with that. Some of them have brain abnormalities that are from birth, others have toxins, others have, complications of medications they're taking or drugs. So these can be top down or bottom up, and very often they're both. So it's not simple. I'd really love doctors to all really understand both sides of it instead of trying to simplify too much.
Mhm. Great. One of the questions I've also asked people is, if you look back on papers you've written over the years, is there anything, you had mentioned that you would rethink your ideas about aging that you originally started out with.
Yes,
Are
right.
there any published papers that you would rewrite given what you know now?
Gosh, I'd like to rewrite all of them. A preoccupation of mine ever since I started, that it was a real trauma for me, actually, to really grasp selfish gene theory.
Mhm.
And several people I've written about lying awake at night after night, thinking, oh my God, everything I thought I was doing in life that was generous is actually just selfish in a sneaky way.
Mhm.
The idea is provoked really by Travers and Alexander and the like. But both from my personal experience and my clinical experience, it just didn't ring true to me.
Mhm.
Because I kept, talking with people who'd lie awake nights thinking, did I accidentally offend somebody, or it just didn't seem like everybody was slyly getting an advantage by deceiving other people every time. And so I've been really preoccupied that. First I went through the standard thing we all do about kin selection and group selection and all that. Not a satisfying kinds of answer there. Then I ran a conference and did a book about evolution and the capacity for commitment, which is not the nice kind of romantic commitment, it's game theory commitment, which can be positive or negative commitments to do things that aren't in your self-interest. Dan Kruger and I did some research following up from that to try to find examples. But more recently, I feel like I found an answer that's satisfying to me, actually, in Mary Jane West Eberhard's work, where she talks about social selection. And in a word, she says, if animals that are preferred as mates get selective advantages which shape extreme traits. Likewise, individuals who are preferred as social partners get huge advantages. And what do you have to do to become a preferred social partner? You have to be generous and loyal to your friend and do things that make you useful. And she pointed out that this could lead to runaway selection. I'm not quite sure if it leads to runaway or not. I've written a couple of articles about this that people seem to find useful, and more people are trying to look at how the choices individuals make create selection forces. And these are choices that are perfectly selfish choices. So this is an Adam Smith invisible hand kind of thing.
Mhm.
Everybody makes selfish choices about who they partner with, and not just romantic relationships, all kinds of other partnerships.
Mhm.
And in making those choices, they create selection forces that I think create prosociality of the kind that only humans have.
Mhm.
But this is a great current topic for all of us to talk about. It's so exciting that there's more work to be done in all of this.
Yeah. You have a paper you did with Stephanie Brown,
Yeah.
which gets a lot of citations on
Right.
the sort of positive side of psychology. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Stephanie Brown's been a great collaborator. She came to do a postdoc with us at the Institute for Social Research. And she showed she used a database from this bereavement project that we did and showed that people who helped others lived longer and did better than people who received help from others. And she has some fairly specific ideas about how natural selection might have shaped those kinds of mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tough issue, though, because the confounding variables are fairly substantial.
Mm-hmm.
There have been a couple of replications of it, but another area where a lot more work is needed.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the work that you did with Kruger. Can
Yeah.
you go into one of the papers that you like most that came out of your collaborations with him?
Yeah, Dan and I have done a series of papers together about mortality rates for males versus females. And this started in the simplest way. I was just going to try to create a slide for my lecture on evolutionary medicine showing that men die 70 years younger than women. and I couldn't find the right number. But what I did find is a database from the World Health Organization that had mortality rates by age and by sex and by country and by decade going back 100 years.
Mm.
And so I had the greatest time. I took them down the basement with Excel and spent a summer trying to figure out what to do with them. And the right answer turned out to be looking at the ratio for each 100 men who die, or for each 100 women who die, how many men die.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it would be 20% excess, maybe 120. But when I finally ran the numbers, it was more like 300 men who died. And I was just blown away. It was just so interesting, looking at a data set that had been sitting there all this time, and with Dan's help, writing several papers about the evolutionary explanations for why males invest so much more in competition and less in tissue repair and sensible behavior. That's been a fun series of papers.
Right. It's good stuff. The history of HBES. We didn't
Right.
talk too much about that, but you were there at the beginning. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Right. So after I started, meeting with people in the museum, that was just about the time there were these annual meetings with Martin and Margot coming from McMaster and Abshagnon coming over, and Bill Ahrens coming from Northwestern. Just the most intellectually rich times. I didn't realize I was with the world's best people. They just seemed like really smart, fun people to hang out with and drink with and talk all night about these kind of things. I'd love to recreate that atmosphere as best one can. We slept at each other's houses, and it was really a great situation. Richard Wrangham then went to Billy Fry, who was our provost at the time, and said, we need to do more of this at Michigan, have support for this. And Billy Fry said, well, why don't you write a proposal? And he did. I actually asked if I could kind of rewrite it, and then in the process it expanded from $100,000 to $500,000, and miraculously they gave us the money. And that led to the Evolution in Human Behavior program in Michigan, where 7 of us spent the next 5 years talking together every week and having great postdocs like Monique Berhoff-Boulder. Paul Turk and Laura Betziger were deeply involved with that. And so we just had great conversations every week about one thing or another and organized conferences. But at the end of that time, we didn't have any funding from the federal government, and the university had a bunch of bigwigs called into a room to assess our program. They said it was all very interesting, but there was no money, and they decided to discontinue it. And at that point, I got together with Bobby Lowe, and we decided that this had to continue somehow. So we organized one last meeting with the remaining funds, and with the idea that maybe we could get people to form a society. And it worked. The key to it really was asking Bill Hamilton if he'd be the president. Mm-hmm. And he said, yes, if you'll be the second president and I don't have to do anything. And then Martin and Margot agreed to be on the board, and Barb Smutz's father, who was really into this stuff, and he'd been instrumental in writing the bylaws for the Animal Behavior Society. So he took on the job of writing the first bylaws for the society, and we presented those to the board, and we had a big meeting to figure out the name for the society at this meeting, and tried to get someone to organize the first official meeting. And Bill Ahrens and the Northwestern gang said, we'll do it, and then the society was off and running.
Wow. Has anything surprised you since then about the development of the Human Behavior and Evolution Society?
That it's grown so fast and endured so well has been wonderful, and there wasn't any really predicting that. It's really been a marvelous thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
A few challenges along the way.
Like?
It almost didn't happen. For that very first meeting where we were trying to organize a society, we wanted to be completely egalitarian. Anybody who wants to talk can talk.
Mm-hmm.
And there on the program was Philippe Rushton's name. Mm-hmm. And several students came and said, if he's there, we're going to make sure that the meeting doesn't happen. And some other people said the same kind of thing. And it fell to me to call up Philippe and talk with him and say, listen, we're not going to disinvite you, but if you come, the meeting will be disrupted by potentially violent people who have vowed to make sure it's not possible, and the society will not form. And I think we talked on the phone for 2 solid hours that night, and he finally said, okay, well, if you guys can't guarantee my safety, I guess I won't come. Very awkward, awful stuff. Very tense times.
Hmm.
You know, there's an interesting history about how we got the journal going. Mike McGuire, who actually a psychiatrist from UCLA, had created this journal with Elsevier called Ethology and Sociobiology, clearly the leading journal of its kind. And when we formed the society, we realized we needed a journal, and we considered a journal that was called, there was one that was not at all about evolution of human behavior. It was called something like that. But we decided we needed to take it over, and it fell to me and the publications committee to figure out how to do that. And again, it was kind of tricky because, what we were doing with sociobiology, we liked the idea and we all admired Ed Wilson, but the word was so closely associated with him that it didn't, wouldn't work for getting submissions from people from the breadth of the field. And so the committee finally decided it should be changed to Evolution of Human Behavior, and that was done in conjunction with Martin Daly and Margaret Wilson agreeing to take on the chair and negotiating a new contract with Elsevier and that kind of thing. And it all worked. That journal, I think, has done more for the field than just about anything else. We can all have one central source. Human Nature has been useful also, Jane Lancaster's journal. But having a central way for us all to share information and critique each other's papers, I think has been really crucial for the field.
Yeah. It's very interdisciplinary.
Yeah.
Remains so. The people in the different disciplines who make up the Human Behavior and Evolution Society, they go by, you're talking about names like sociobiologists,
Yeah.
and then there's behavioral ecologists and evolutionary psychologists. And what do you think of those distinctions? Do you think that they're meaningful, worth keeping? Anything that we should...
When we first organized the society, we tried very intentionally to make sure it not only was massively interdisciplinary, but stayed that way. And we tried to write bylaws saying there had to be, as much diversity as possible. You had to have anthropologists and basic biologists and geneticists and computer scientists and doctors even. And that's something that is hard to maintain in a group, because groups kind of coalesce towards a center, which has turned out to be more evolutionary anthropology and evolutionary psychology. I think that was just an inevitable progression, probably. But all these big debates that happened back in the late 80s and early 90s about evolutionary anthropology or evolutionary psychology, I tried to understand them, but I never quite got into them the way a lot of people did. Interesting human groups do to make those kind of divisions. I don't think those are still there in the same way now. What do you think?
Yeah, I was just interested in your perspective. It seems to me that some of the work that you described with Kruger, for example, it's what we would probably consider behavioral ecology.
It's demography, really.
Right, and then other work that you do is certainly evolutionary psychology, and then to me sociobiology encompasses it all. And I've never thought much of these debates about the names, and I agree with you about the name of the journal, that sociobiology did have a history. But then evolutionary psychology now, amongst some groups, people think, well, it's sort of like when you change the name of some disorder to try to lower the stigma. People catch up and realize what it is. And for me, I never loved it, although I do think that, and here we're interviewing you rather than me.
That's fine.
It strikes me that the different areas bring in different emphases. So the behavioral ecologists have some ways that they slice reality that we in psychology don't typically. Thinking about things like density, resource scarcity, and so forth that's the MO of the behavioral ecologists. And I like bringing it into psychology, but it doesn't make sense to me to then still continue to have a division between behavioral ecologists and evolutionary psychologists or sociobiologists, and in some sense we're all people that are interested in applying any ideas about evolution that might help us understand human behavior.
Right. So do you think it is kind of getting more towards the center now and all one field with various perspectives?
It feels that way to me, certainly within the evolutionary psych part of it, which I'm more familiar with.
Yeah. At Michigan, I joined the psychology department about the time David Buss departed, and I never created an evolutionary psychology program there. Instead, we tried to integrate evolution into everything. And that had its advantages and disadvantages. It meant we were less of a center than when David was running things. But it also made it less threatening to people in some ways, because they didn't feel like it was a challenging kind of perspective. It was just another basic science you could use.
Right.
Yeah.
In the years since the society started, a number of the sort of founding folks, from HBES and the larger group, have passed away, and they've been asking people, do you have any specific memories or thoughts about particular individuals that were there back then?
There must be people like George Williams and Bill Hamilton and John Maynard Smith around now, but it's hard to identify them. I mean, in this project I'm doing now, creating a new center, I keep calling up people and saying, where's the Bill Hamilton of our time? And everybody has I talked to Bernie Crespi about that today. People have a hard time figuring that out, and I do too. But the characteristic of these people was that they were just plain interested in science, and all of them were willing to talk with anybody. And they weren't all highfalutin. They didn't have big grants. They were just curious people who were brighter than the rest of us and inspired us. George, for me, of course, especially George. I mean, he was essentially my mentor in biology, and we wrote every word of our book together 10 times. I'd do a chapter, he'd do the same chapter over again. I'd do it over again, he'd do it over again. So, in fact, we had a deal. We'd send chapters back and forth to each other in the mail on computer disks. And the second person would edit the whole thing and send it back. And if you could remember the way you had it in the first place without looking, you could change it back. But otherwise you couldn't. But George was a deep and complicated man. He was horrified by the implications of evolution for human behavior. He even wrote something called Is Mother Nature a Wicked Witch, with the idea that anything shaped by natural selection has to be inherently evil, because only selfishness can survive and reproduce. And the irony, of course, is that he was one of the most generous and moral people you would ever want to meet. So I think this was a very personal thing for him, and it was the one area where we disagreed, but at great length. Dick Alexander is still with us, but not that active anymore. He was more of a wonderfully critical type who would just blast anything around him in a very useful way. And both John Maynard Smith and Bill Hamilton also just would talk with you about things, even though you didn't know what you were talking about at first. You learn from listening to them and talking with them. I bet there are people like that today that we're just not recognizing someplace. They probably haven't gotten tenure because they haven't gotten big grants.
Yes, well,